Okay, so welcome to sort of part two, if you want to look at it that way, of sort of compositing the RC car. Now, crucially, what I've done this time around is got a lighting pass. You might remember when we were looking at part one, we only had a diffuse pass, and a diffuse pass is great. We can just look at the difference between the diffuse and the lighting pass here initially. So here's my diffuse, and then here's my lighting. So you can see the lighting pass is much darker overall. We've got a bit of shadow in here. We've got the same basic colour. It's still kind of, obviously it's not got any reflection, refraction or specular highlights in it, so it's still a sort of soft, almost felt like shaded, but we do have a bit of lighting direction in here. So this is now going to be much closer. If you remember, I said the original idea was here's our beauty pass with kind of everything just together from the render, the sort of default render you'd get from Maya, but here's our lighting pass, and we merged in our refractor. I haven't changed anything there. We merged in our specular for our tyres here, and then by the time we merge in our reflection, we've got something here that's looking pretty much similar to our beauty pass, hopefully identical to our beauty pass. So there's actually that, and if we just do a quick, I suppose, connection of viewer, and we do a sort of shift 2 or something like that, we can see these two things are pretty much, there's probably some slight edge difference here. I can look at this kind of thing here, but sensibly these are the pretty much the same image here. Yep. So that's good. That's what we're certainly aiming for at this stage. We don't want to be messing around and making it different just because we haven't combined the render elements correctly. If we want to make it different, we want to make it be different in quite a deliberate fashion. Right. So we've then got these grades. They're not really doing much right now. We've got this lens distort here, and we've got our kind of supposedly final merge. Now this is already looking a lot better than when we were using our diffuse element in here. Got something that's kind of sort of at least vaguely plausible. So what sort of things might we want to add in here? Well, there's a few, so let's create a little bit more room down here. I'm going to need some more nodes here, so I'm just going to move down these kind of things here to create a bit of added space. Right, so I know that here, if I look at this node here, this is just my car, distorted, nothing else. So what might we want to do to this? Well, first thing is we may well want to do a blur on all of our CG. Yeah, we may well want a grade on the whole thing. Yeah, we could have our separate elements, but we may think the whole thing is a bit bright, bit dark. Yeah, we may add, if we just want to adjust brightness, we may want to use an exposure node. Now I'm just going to look at these individually. Now it's probably easiest when we're making these adjustments to look at our final merge, because obviously when it comes to the composite, it's all about how this looks in the final image that's important. So if I go to my blur here, most CG is rendered a little too sharp. Yep. Depends on the lens, obviously, but most lenses are a little bit soft. Oh, I've just nudged it forward a couple of frames there. Let's just move it back in. Just got this, you know, sort of quite large in the view, but kind of clearly visible. That's nice. So we might choose to say, right, okay, is this slightly sharper than other elements in this shot? And yeah, it probably is. So what we might do is just apply a little touch of a blur. Most of these things are quite subtle, you know, onto this whole image here. And to be honest, you're probably looking at something like a 2 to 3 pixel blur. We can already see the difference. If I just take that blur, just temporarily disable it, you can see, especially if you look at the kind of roof line there, and I kind of add my blur, so I'm already seeing something that's looking quite different. Yeah, edge is looking a little bit different, and it's kind of just softer. So something like that. The amount of blur obviously will depend, because it's a sort of pixel blur, on the resolution of your image. So if you have a high resolution image, probably a larger blur is going to be needed to produce roughly the same effect as on a lower resolution image. So, and that's just a static blur. That's going to blur every frame and every pixel, essentially, sort of within it. You can think of as kind of receiving the same sort of treatment. So an exposure node, what does that do? Well, exposure, as you kind of imagine with a camera, kind of basically brighter, darker. So what I like is usually to think of it in stops as densities, but for me personally, I tend to think better in stops. So we can think of these as being aperture stops. Now by default they're all ganged together, so if I make an adjustment to red, it's going to apply it to green and blue as well. Obviously this kind of gang thing here is by default, you can unselect that. So if I kind of select 1 for red, it's going to increase the light by 1 stop, i.e. double the amount of light. It's an aperture stop on a camera for red, green and blue equally. So it's going to make the whole image brighter. Again, obviously if I'm getting into lots of stops here, I'm going to get into something that looks awful. So, but if I wanted to adjust overall image brightness, obviously you can use fractional values, and kind of manipulate those. You can use negative values, clearly, and then you're just going to be darkening it by a stop or 2 stops or whatever it might be. But you're darkening, and of course you're darkening just the car image, because this bit of the Nuke node graph hasn't yet brought in the background. So here I'm only dealing with the car. So there we go. Just going to perhaps leave that there for now. Obviously the grade here you might use to grade the whole car. So with the grade, most of these values, most of the time you want to keep between 0 and 1, with the exception of gamma. Gamma is going to adjust the midpoint of the image. Often for color corrects, small gamma corrections are very useful for that. The nice thing about a gamma is it keeps the very darkest point the same value, the very brightest bit of your image the same, but it's changing the kind of midpoint of your image. By default, when you're doing it with all RGB channels here, it's kind of essentially adjusting the kind of ramp of brightness between light and dark in your image, so it's quite a powerful color correction, and overall a gamma shift might be the sort of thing that you might want to do just to tweak a kind of composite. Your black point and white point controls, as you increase your black point, you're kind of sort of expanding the darker areas. So things that were quite dark are now becoming darker. So, and similarly for your white point, if you lower your white point from 1 down towards 0, you're taking the brightest areas of your image and you're kind of expanding how much of your image is sort of clipping up to white. So as this control comes down and down, I'm going to start finding that, there we go, that this kind of image, more and more of the bright bits are now going to pure white. Okay, may not want that. And then we've got lift and gain. So if I take my lift control and lift that up, it's kind of just working on the whole image here, including the back plates. I'm probably not going to want to work with that too much at the moment. Multiply, as you can imagine, that's just going to brighten the whole thing up. So it's just going to like literally multiply the color values in all cases, or multiply them by a lower value in some cases. So it's kind of working a little bit like an exposure control, but I think the exposure control for me kind of is more meaningful in the way it works. Okay, and that's by default operating on all channels equally. So just like the exposure control, in exposure you could ungang that and then just make controls to just a single one. So reds, it's just going to make the reds much brighter but leave everything else as they were. The same in our grade control down here. These numbers here, if we pull those out, they give us our separate RGB and alpha controls. So this is obviously our reds, our greens, our blues, and our alphas. So you can make a change to red gamma and leave the others alone. In which case we're kind of giving this a very, very different look. Okay, so, and you can just go back to your kind of default single control when you like. Okay, so we might well want to have an exposure and a grade, and again it would depend on your background image as to kind of how you might adjust that, but they're quite common controls you might want for the whole thing as well as the individual render elements. The blur is pretty common. We might want a bit of motion blur, so I'm going to add a vector blur node in here, and I've actually got a slightly different one in there. I'm using standard Nuke. Okay, I'm just going to pause this here. Okay, so here we are. We want to kind of carry on with this. So we've got our velocity pass here, so we want to add a bit of motion blur. So we've got a velocity pass, and we want to kind of merge it in here. Now we could do this various ways. I'm just going to create a copy node because I'm going to copy this data. So our vector blur really needs this data to be part of this pipe. It doesn't really have a kind of arrow input for this data really in the vector blur node, so you have to kind of merge it with everything here. But I don't of course want to take this velocity pass because it kind of looks like this. These are the different channels, and I don't want to kind of merge that on top of it visibly, obviously, because it look awful. So what I've got is a copy node, and I've got the B pipe going up into my main tree, and I'm going to connect my A pipe into here. Now, of course, this velocity pass has also been rendered out of my CG, so this is also an undistorted pass. So I'm going to make sure that I add my lens distort. I'm just going to copy that, paste it on to here, because that also needs to run through this distortion pipeline. So okay, that's great. So that's going into here to my copy node. Now I want to choose what channels to copy. Now if I look at my velocity pass here, it's kind of this weird funky looking colour, and I can see if I look at my red channel, okay, that's grey with some white here. If I look at my green channel, okay, that's grey with some stuff here, and if I look at my blue channel, that's just mid-grey. Now the way a velocity channel typically works, different 3D applications are slightly different. If you think of kind of these channels as representing motion across X and Y axes, so not quite sure which is which, but let's imagine that a red channel is showing us motion in the X axis. Yeah? So the colour of the pixel is showing you how much it's moving and in which speed in the X axis. So mid-grey is normally taken as no movement. So all these pixels that are mid-grey are not moving. These pixels here that are white, probably things that are brighter than mid-grey, are moving, and the brighter they are, the more they're moving, let's say, right. Yeah? If they were lower than mid-grey, darker towards black, they'd be moving left, and the darker they were, the sort of faster they'd be moving left, is a way of thinking about it. So that would be one axis, and then our green channel would kind of be showing maybe a y-axis motion, something like that. Yep. And then our blue channel basically is all mid-grey, it's not really showing us anything. So we only need really our red and green channel from here. So in my copy node, I can do that. Now, this is a velocity pass, but basically, as far as Nuke's concerned, it's a RGB image. So I want to copy my RGBA red and my RGBA green from this velocity pass. That's what this copy node is going to copy from. And where am I going to put them? Well, I can put them in an existing channel that I know isn't really doing anything, or I can create a new one. I'm going to create a new one. So I'm going to create a new channel. I'm going to call it Beetle underscore motion, and I'm going to say .r for red. I'm just going to say OK. Create new layer Beetle motion. Yep. And copy channel RGBA green. I'm going to put that into new, and I'm going to put that into Beetle motion. So the same channel .g. Yep. So there we go. So they've gone into Beetle motion. Right? So if I look at this image here now, so I look at that copy node, it's going to show me mainly that. But if I go up to here, my RGBA, there will now be this new layer, Beetle motion. And if I look at that, this is my red channel here, and this is my green channel, so there's my red channel rather, there's my green channel, they're looking the same as they used to, remember in the velocity thing. My blue channel of course is black, which explains why the kind of main RGBA image is looking more yellow, because of course this composite image has the mid-grey in the red channel, mid-grey in the green channel, but nothing in the blue channel, whereas previously it did have mid-grey, so that's why its background's slightly different. Okay, so let's put it in there. So let's actually go about creating this vector blur. So I'm going to create a vector blur node, and I'm just going to pop that in here. Yep. So my vector blur now, if I look at my final merge node, yep. So let's look at my final merge node, and let's go back. When I looked at my Beetle motion, I want to go back to my RGBA over here. Right, that's better. Yeah, okay, so here's my merge node. And if I go to my vector blur, I could add a little bit of motion blur. Now, a lot of these things, like, well, how much do I need to add? Well, a lot of that is done by eye. But if I take my vector blur, you can see it says, okay, what channels do I want to blur? All of them. Where are my UV channels? This is basically where's the data that tells me how fast this thing is moving. And that is in our Beetle motion layer, yeah, that we've just created. So I'm going to go down and say, right, they're in Beetle motion. And hey presto, it's going to add its default amount of motion blur to this, which is way too much. Yeah, this looks awful. Yeah. Now, it does say, if you hover over that, sets to 0.5 for motion blur from a standard shutter. Well, if we add that, there we go. For me, that's still way too much for this particular shot. Right? So I'm just going to adjust this a little by eye. I'm going to set this maybe to 0.1 to multiply. That's looking nicer. Yeah, you can see here that basically the body is not looking too different, but the tyres that are obviously moving faster than the body is, because they're rotating around many times more per second, they're getting a bit of motion blur on. You can easily see it just by disabling this motion blur temporarily. So it is blurring the body as well, but certainly the tyres are getting the majority of that motion blur. Yeah. So I could even maybe even kind of lower this to lower than that, to 0.05 or something like that. So that's off, that's on, and that's almost quite nice itself. Yeah. And subtle effects are kind of what I'm looking for mainly here. I can easily see that if I look at that tyre there, and I look at that's kind of no motion blur, and that's with motion blur active. Yeah. So it's getting some kind of motion blur onto that wheel. Yeah. Okay. And obviously one could adjust to taste. So we're kind of working with this. So other things we could choose to work with. Obviously we have a zDepth channel. So somewhere over here we had a zDepth, and we could choose to kind of produce a shallow depth of field. Now that would look fairly fake in this shot because we don't have a dramatic depth of field throughout most of this. Okay, really close to the camera because it's a very low shot, so this is incredibly low down here. We do have a bit of defocus, but majority of this shot is got a fairly reasonable aperture or set on the camera, so we're not experiencing dramatic depth of field. Right? But just for argument's sake, we might have a quick look here about how we use our zDepth channel, because your shot might be different. You may have more of an actual depth of field in your background plate, so just to kind of see what we could do with this. Right, so our zDepth channel tends to look a bit like this. Yeah? So it's a grayscale. It might show up red because sometimes the Z channel only has data in the red channel, so it firstly appears red. This has got equal intensity in RG and B because it's been rendered out that way. So again, you'd usually copy that data into your pass here. Yeah? So I might just kind of be lazy and copy and paste that node in there. Again, I'd want to distort my zDepth because you know, it's kind of the way that we would kind of have to work with that. Yeah, so I'd kind of have a distort going in there. Now, obviously I wouldn't want to put it in the Beetle motion channel, that would be a bit of a waste. So I'm going to look at my copy node here, go back to here, and I only really need my red channel, because they're all the same. you know, this is my blue channel, there's my red channel, there's my green channel, and there's RGB. So one of the channels is fine. And I don't want to copy that into Beetle Motion, and I'm going to copy this into depth.z. Yeah, that's already a kind of sensible default place to put that. Yep. So I'm going to copy that into my depth channel. Yep. So I now have, if I look at this copy node here, here's this, and again I can now go to depth, and depth has some data in it. I only put it in the red channel, so it looks red, but basically I only need it in one of them. So I go back to RGBA. So the default node then you'd probably use to do some stuff here is your ZDefocus node. So again, that's probably on your filters, and there's your ZDefocus. Right. So with your ZDefocus, we can hook this up here, and we can say, right, we would like a ZDefocus coming into here. You can give it a filter if you like as well. We don't need that. So let's look at this here. So our ZDefocus node is going to use by default the depth.z channel, which we've already got in there. So it's actually doing something fairly useful. Now we might need to change some of these other options, but you can see, let's just see if this works. Here's a default focal point, and if you drag this, it should try and make that point in focus and the rest slightly defocused, depending on the other aperture settings and all the rest of it you've got set in your scene. Now a lot of this is going to highly dependent on what your zDepth channel looks like. Now if we look at this, we can see that basically this is getting brighter the further away from the camera it is. Yeah, at least it looks like they're on the ground. These pillars are further away than here. Yeah, so it's kind of, and you can see the back inside of the car there is a lighter color than the front bit here of the car. So you know, this zDepth channel is working that far equals black. Far equals white, rather, sorry, I'm kind of going mad here. Yeah. So you can see there's these options here. Basically, because depth channels are always different from different 3D applications, you need to kind of interpret them. Yeah. So you can have direct, Z directly controls blur, depth Z is distance in front of camera, depth Z. Yep, so we could go for that one. We could go for depth. So Z is distance in front of camera, yeah, so the brighter the kind of further goes. We could go for far equals 1, so you know, white, yeah. So that's going to be the obvious ones to kind of experiment with, yeah. So if I go back and I look at my my ZDefocus rather than my zDepth here, yeah. So I can kind of manipulate this focal point. Maybe put it on this tire here or something like that. Now I'm not seeing anything too dramatic here, but that's probably going to depend on the values that we've got here for our focal plane and all the rest of it. So this is where you often need to do a bit of setup. Now in the ZDefocus node, by default, you're looking at the result. Yeah? So the result of our Z blur, but it's probably sensible to go to focal plane setup. So what this shows is not the blur. It's basically showing us 3 different colours, yeah? Red, green and blue. Right? Now the green regions are intended to be the region, there's only a tiny bit of green, we can see just here and around this kind of point here, that are in focus. Yep. And then we've got these 2 red and blue regions, which are kind of working slightly oddly, because of course we've got a black background here because we didn't have anything in there, and it doesn't really matter outside the car anyway because that part of the image is actually all black. We're not blurring the background on the whole thing. Yeah. We could take that and we could manipulate this little bit here, but yeah, so basically if you think of when you get defocus on a real lens, some of the scene might be defocused because it's too close to the camera, then you might have a region that's in focus, and then you may have a region that's out of focus because it's too far away from the camera. And that's what these red, green and blue do. Green is the bit in focus, I can't remember which way around it is, but let's say red is too close to the camera, blue is too far from the camera. Yeah, so slightly weird here. And then we have our depth of field. Right? So as we increase the depth of field, more of the shot is going to become entirely in focus. So you can see as we increase this, we're kind of saying, right, okay, well this bit is in focus. Yeah. So it's like changing the aperture at some level on the camera. Yeah? If you kind of had a very small aperture, more of the shot is in focus. If you've got a very large aperture, then you're kind of not so much. Yeah. So you can see how this is kind of working on this whole shot here. Yeah. So we could kind of maybe say, well, maybe we want like a bit of the car to kind of be in focus there, stuff like that. Then we've got the size of the blur at infinite depth. So it's basically kind of increasing how much the defocus is. So when it's defocused, how much does it get blurred at that infinite depth in the scene? And then we've got our focal point here, and then we've got our focus plane. Now, focus plane is the value of depth that will be in focus. Yeah, so it's a bit like this focal point setting, but you can see it's another way of controlling. Okay, which bit goes to be in focus? Yeah, it's another way of setting up our focal plane. So here we could say, okay, maybe maybe we want like a certain part. So remember that anything that isn't green is not completely in focus. Yeah, so we might want, let's say, the front of the car to be a bit in focus, but not too much. Yeah, so things closer to the camera. Yeah, maybe there, something like that. Yep. I remember this in theory, all of these could be animated. This is static. So basically that sets up your focal plane. And then when you want to look at the result of that, you just flip back to result. And of course you want to leave it on result at the end. Yeah. So the idea is that this is kind of going to blur this. But of course that is going to be true throughout the whole shot. So you need to be a bit careful. You're not just looking at this on one single frame, because that's the distance that we set to be in focus. So if we go back earlier in the shot, and we go back to, because it's an animated sequence, the car should be further away. We might find that depending on the amount of blur that we'd got set for our zDefocus, that we were getting quite a lot more blur happening as it was in a different bit of the scene. Yeah. Okay, so that's our zDefocus. And of course we could do the zDefocus on the whole thing. So we could kind of merge in the background if we wanted to. We could kind of copy that out. We could even paste that in here so that it happens after the merge. So we've got our merge with the background here. And we could even say, right, well, we'd actually like to do that on the entire thing and kind of fake a depth of field in the entire shot. Now, depending on the settings and the amount of blur you've got, you may not get too much there. Yeah. Yeah, my zDefocus is still kind of not doing too much at that point there. Let's up my blur. Let's take my let's do this here. Kind of take this forward a little bit here. Cool there. Yeah, and we can kind of narrow our depth of field a little bit. Just going to have a think about that, no doubt. Nope, I'm not getting too much of a motion blur. Sorry, defocus there. So I probably need to go back and tweak my my settings. I'm getting a bit more with depth there. Yeah, okay, so you may need to experiment a little bit with your various options in there on the whole shot. Yep. So zDefocus is used for kind of a sort of vaguely fake depth of field. Yep. Okay, something else we may want, I'm just going to temporarily disable my zDefocus there, is a bit of LightWrap. Now your LightWrap is used to kind of sort of add spill. Yep. So what you would frequently do is you'd add a LightWrap node to your background here, but you then want to say, right, what I want to do, LightWrap basically is when you put an object in an environment, it should get some light sort of spilled onto it from the background. It's a bit like global illumination in 3D. We know we get these diffuse bounces off objects and they kind of affect other objects that are near them. Well, you get that in obviously the real world. So we've got this CG car, but when it was rendered, okay, it was lit with an HDR and all the rest of it, which has done a fantastic job, giving us some nice reflections. But we may still want to add a little bit of LightWrap. So we'd connect this LightWrap node to our background. So we can kind of pop that into that dot node there, kind of do the job really, of taking it in there. Yep. Maybe have a little node there. And if I just look at my LightWrap node here, as we increase this intensity here, what we should get a little bit of, if we've got it connected around the right way, is, no, definitely that way, is we should be taking a little bit of spill from the background. Now let's just kind of have a quick look at this. Getting anything here? No, a little bit there. So I need to, let's just up some of these values a little bit to some sort of crazy intensity. And let's undisable that. And I've got some values here. Am I seeing any change? LightWrap and oh yeah, there we go. Just make sure I was connecting it to the viewer. So we can see here, it's quite subtle with the values that I've got on here. So the diffuse intensity is obviously how distributed, how soft essentially this effect is. So with a very low value, we should get quite a harsh element. As we increase our intensity, we're kind of making it more pronounced. So you can see this edge detail here with a really high intensity. Look at my edges, I'm kind of getting that. As I increase this diffuse value, it's kind of spreading that out a little bit more. Yeah. Yep. So I go up to 20 here or whatever. Yep. Yep. So it's kind of how much of that and how much I want it spread out. And again, you can just see, if I look, this is kind of a massive value here really for this intensity. If you look at that rear wheel arch, you can see what it's doing is it's taking pixels from the background image and it's trying to kind of sort of add some of their value to the color in the foreground. Yeah. Now that intensity is crazy. I just upped it there as a kind of example. Yeah. You would want a much lower intensity in all likelihood. Yeah. And you might want a fairly diffuse effect. Yeah. Again, most of the stuff you want to be fairly subtle. Yeah. You can see it's making big differences around the edge there of that wheel arch, stuff like that. Maybe I want a little bit more diffuse. That's a bit better. A bit more diffuse. Maybe a bit lower intensity. Yep. So I'm still getting a bit of an effect there. That's nice. Yep. So, you know, LightWrap, and again, it's just another subtle effect that's kind of going into your finished shot. Yeah. So, starting to look sort of reasonably halfway decent at this stage. Yeah. So there we go. So let's looked at a few things there. We've looked at taking our basic element, we've replaced it with a lighting pass, which made a big difference. Looking at maybe adding a little bit of static blur. Looking at that option of changing the exposure and the grade, we didn't in the end of this particular shot. Looking at taking our velocity pass, adding a little bit of vector motion blur, possibly doing a little bit of Z defocus, so bringing in our zDepth pass. Looking at a bit of LightWrap there. We've still got our existing merge and right nodes in there, so they're all basically fine there. And then over here, that's just our original beauty pass over there. So we've got a few unused nodes like our diffuse over there at the end. And we've still got our same right node out at the end there. Right? Now, of course, we could create, as we've said, other right nodes out, especially for VFX breakdowns. But I'll look at perhaps the VFX breakdown in another video another time. Okay, so let's just stop here for now. So thanks for watching. Hope that's been useful to you. Okay.